On the morning of May 10, 1940, the serene landscapes of Western Europe were shattered by the roar of German engines and the unrelenting march of armored divisions. In cities and villages that had never known the horrors of modern warfare, ordinary citizens awoke to the terrifying reality that their world was about to change forever. The skies above Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France were pierced by the drones of Luftwaffe planes, their silhouettes casting ominous shadows over towns that had, until recently, seemed immune to the devastation of war. It was the beginning of a campaign that would redefine Europe and plunge millions into fear, deprivation, and uncertainty. The Blitzkrieg, Germany's so-called lightning war, was no mere military tactic. It was a calculated assault designed to annihilate opposition before it could even form. For the people of these countries, there was little time to grasp the enormity of what was coming. The invasion was meticulously planned. Germany had spent years preparing for this moment, studying maps, rehearsing maneuvers, and exploiting the weaknesses of its neighbors. The once formidable Maginot Line, France's defensive fortification along its eastern border, was bypassed entirely. German forces swept through the Ardennes forest, a region considered too dense and impassable for large-scale military movement. This unexpected maneuver allowed tanks and troops to pour into Belgium and Luxembourg, taking both the military and civilian populations by surprise. Within days, what was meant to be a brief conflict escalated into full-scale occupation. Cities that had celebrated the end of the First World War with relief and hope now found themselves under the shadow of a new and terrifying oppressor. In the Netherlands, the German advance was swift and unrelenting. The Dutch army, although brave, was ill-prepared to withstand the speed and coordination of the German forces. Within a matter of days, key cities had fallen. Rotterdam, a vibrant commercial hub, became the symbol of this brutal efficiency when the Luftwaffe unleashed a devastating aerial bombardment on May 14, 1940. The fires consumed entire neighborhoods, and tens of thousands of civilians were left homeless, their lives extinguished or shattered in an instant. The psychological impact was profound. Families fled their homes, seeking refuge wherever they could, only to find that the German occupation was not a temporary inconvenience but a permanent and oppressive reality. The Netherlands had surrendered, and the country would enter a period of strict German administration, marked by curfews, forced labor, and the systematic targeting of Jewish citizens. Belgium, too, faced the crushing weight of the German war machine. The Belgian army fought valiantly, resisting the invaders with determination and courage, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by the combination of rapid mechanized warfare and relentless aerial attacks. By May 28, 1940, Belgium had formally surrendered. The consequences were immediate and profound. German authorities imposed strict military control, dismantling existing political structures and installing occupation authorities loyal to Berlin. Economic exploitation began almost immediately, with resources, industrial output, and agricultural production redirected to support the German war effort. Civilians faced curfews, rationing, and the constant threat of arbitrary arrest or deportation. Yet even in these dark times, a spirit of resistance began to emerge. Underground networks formed, smuggling information, sabotaging German operations, and providing crucial support to Allied intelligence. These acts of defiance, though small in scale at first, would later play a pivotal role in undermining German control. France, the largest of the three countries under assault, faced a catastrophic collapse. German forces advanced with remarkable speed, bypassing the Maginot Line and plunging through northern France. The fall of Paris on June 14, 1940, was a psychological blow not only to the French nation but to the world. France, once the epitome of cultural sophistication and military might, now lay under the shadow of German boots. An armistice was signed on June 22, dividing the country into two distinct zones. The north and west fell under direct German occupation, while the south became the so-called Vichy regime, a puppet government led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. Though the Vichy government retained nominal authority, its policies were heavily influenced by German directives, and it soon became complicit in implementing anti-Semitic laws, deporting Jews, and suppressing dissent. The impact of these invasions on ordinary civilians cannot be overstated. Families were uprooted from their homes, forced to flee advancing armies, or trapped under bombed-out cities. Food shortages, disrupted communications, and the collapse of local governance created chaos in daily life. Schools closed, factories were commandeered for military production, and transportation networks were disrupted, leaving cities isolated. For children and the elderly, the occupation was a particularly cruel ordeal. Many were forced to witness the conscription of young men, the arrest of neighbors, and the deportation of entire families. Fear became a constant companion, and trust in public institutions eroded as collaboration and betrayal became widespread. Yet amidst the despair, small acts of courage emerged. Ordinary citizens risked their lives to hide Jews, assist escaped prisoners, or carry messages between resistance cells. These acts of quiet defiance would, over time, weave the intricate fabric of resistance that challenged German authority. The German occupation was not merely a military or political endeavor, it was also an ideological mission. Nazi authorities sought to reshape society according to their vision of racial purity and social hierarchy. Jewish populations in all three countries were systematically identified, registered, and ultimately deported to concentration and labor camps. Intellectuals, political dissidents, and anyone deemed a threat to the Nazi regime faced arrest, torture, or execution. Propaganda campaigns sought to indoctrinate populations, glorifying the Reich and demonizing its enemies. Yet even as the Germans imposed their ideology, cracks in their control became evident. Underground newspapers circulated clandestinely, resistance fighters sabotaged infrastructure, and Allied intelligence relied on information smuggled out of occupied territories to plan future operations. As May turned into June and then into the long months of 1940, it became clear that the occupation was not a temporary phase but a defining chapter in the lives of millions. Streets once filled with laughter and commerce now echoed with the boots of soldiers and the hushed whispers of conspirators. Shops were emptied, cultural institutions shuttered, and communities fractured. Yet life, in its stubborn persistence, continued. Markets reopened under strict regulations, families adapted to rationing, and local leaders attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy. This period, though marked by fear and suffering, laid the groundwork for organized resistance and, eventually, the liberation that would come years later. In retrospect, the German occupation of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands was both swift and transformative. Within a matter of weeks, entire nations had fallen under the control of an aggressive and ideologically driven power. The military brilliance of the Blitzkrieg, combined with the strategic exploitation of weaknesses and surprise maneuvers, ensured rapid conquest. Yet the occupation also ignited the sparks of defiance and resilience. In homes, factories, and hidden rooms, ordinary people began to resist, sowing the seeds of rebellion that would grow into the vast resistance movements of the coming years. The story of May and June 1940 was not just one of defeat, it was also the prologue to courage, ingenuity, and the enduring human spirit that would define the struggle against tyranny. Shadows of control. By the summer of 1940, the initial shock of invasion had settled into a grim reality for the citizens of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. German troops patrolled streets once filled with laughter and chatter, their presence a constant reminder that sovereignty had been replaced by occupation. The speed of conquest had stunned Europe, but the real challenge for the Nazis lay in consolidating power, establishing administration, and suppressing any flicker of defiance. For civilians, life had transformed overnight from ordinary routines to a daily negotiation with fear, regulations, and the unpredictable whims of the occupiers. Occupation was not simply about military presence, it was an intricate system of control, surveillance, and manipulation that aimed to reshape entire societies. In the Netherlands, the German authorities moved quickly to impose a rigid bureaucratic structure. Local governments were subordinated to German officials who oversaw every aspect of civic life, from policing to education. Dutch institutions, while superficially intact, operated under strict guidelines that served the interests of the Reich. Jews were registered, their businesses seized, and their freedom increasingly restricted through laws that mirrored those enacted in Germany. The German administration relied on collaboration from local officials, some of whom cooperated willingly, while others acted under duress. Everyday life was punctuated by curfews, identity checks, and the constant threat of arrest. The once vibrant marketplaces and schools were now sites of careful monitoring, with citizens learning to navigate a precarious balance between compliance and survival. Belgium faced a similar pattern of imposition, though the occupation there carried distinct challenges. German authorities installed a military administration that oversaw economic exploitation, resource extraction, and labor conscription. Factories were repurposed for the German war machine, railways prioritized military transport, and agricultural production was redirected to feed both German troops and the homeland. The civilian population faced rationing, severe shortages, and the bureaucratic demands of occupying forces. Despite this, a sense of quiet resistance began to emerge. Secret networks formed, disseminating information from Allied broadcasts, assisting escaped prisoners, and sabotaging German operations where possible. These acts were perilous, often punishable by imprisonment or execution, yet they reflected the determination of ordinary people to resist the complete domination of their lives. France presented a unique complexity with its division into occupied and unoccupied zones. In the north and west, German military governors controlled towns and cities with an iron fist. Meanwhile, the southern Vichy government under Marshal Philippe Pétain acted as a puppet administration, outwardly independent but functionally subservient to German directives. This dual structure allowed the Nazis to maintain order without deploying excessive manpower, but it also created tensions and contradictions. French citizens were often caught between the demands of Vichy authorities and the expectations of German occupiers. Jews, political activists, and other targeted groups faced systematic discrimination, deportation, and persecution, facilitated by both German and collaborationist French institutions. For the general populace, the occupation imposed an uncomfortable reality. Survival increasingly depended on navigating a landscape dominated by fear, suspicion, and moral compromise. The daily experience of life under occupation was shaped as much by economic hardship as by political repression. Food was rationed, often insufficient for basic needs, and citizens were forced to adjust their diets, barter, or engage in black market activity. Clothing, fuel, and household goods became scarce, while businesses struggled to operate under strict regulations. Education, too, was reshaped to reflect the ideological priorities of the occupiers, with curricula altered to emphasize compliance and the supremacy of the Reich. In towns across all three countries, families learned to cope with the invisible pressures of surveillance and the visible disruptions of occupation, from troop movements to forced labor conscript ions. Resistance, however, persisted even in the face of brutal enforcement. In the Netherlands, clandestine newspapers circulated, sharing news from the outside world and countering Nazi propaganda. Belgian citizens engaged in acts of sabotage, from derailing trains to disrupting telecommunication lines, while in France, networks like the Free French movement provided intelligence and logistical support to the Allies. These networks relied on secrecy, courage, and the cooperation of ordinary people who risked everything to oppose the occupiers. While small in scale initially, these actions would gradually expand, setting the stage for coordinated efforts that contributed to larger Allied operations in later years. The psychological impact of occupation was profound. In cities and villages alike, fear became a constant companion. Citizens lived with the knowledge that informers could be lurking in every neighborhood, that casual conversations could be overheard, and that a single misstep might result in arrest or deportation. Families adapted in myriad ways, from hiding Jewish relatives and neighbors to forging documents and ration cards. Children grew up in an atmosphere where war and repression were normal, their innocence eroded by the harsh realities of life under foreign control. Religious and cultural practices were restricted, and public expression was closely monitored, leaving communities to find private ways to maintain identity and morale. Alongside repression, the occupiers also sought to exploit cultural and social structures to reinforce control. Propaganda campaigns flooded newspapers, radios, and posters, glorifying the Reich and promoting the image of German benevolence, while vilifying Jews, political dissenters, and resistance fighters. Education and youth organizations were co-opted to instill loyalty to Nazi ideology, with particular emphasis on German language, history, and values. This systematic attempt at ideological domination was met with varying degrees of compliance, adaptation, and covert defiance. In homes and clandestine meeting places, citizens taught alternative narratives, preserved banned literature, and nurtured ideas of freedom that would later underpin the liberation movements. Despite the oppressive environment, life under occupation also revealed the resilience and adaptability of civilians. People found ways to maintain daily routines, cultivate gardens for food, and support one another in small but meaningful acts of solidarity. Neighborhoods and extended families became networks of mutual aid, offering protection, sharing scarce resources, and transmitting critical information. In factories and workplaces, subtle acts of resistance slowing production, mislabeling goods, or damaging equipment demonstrated that control, however thorough, was never absolute. These acts, combined with organized resistance, created a persistent undercurrent of opposition that, while often invisible, gradually eroded the occupiers' sense of complete authority. By the end of 1940, it was evident that the occupation was far more than a temporary imposition of military rule. Germany had established a network of control, coercion, and surveillance across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, reshaping social, political, and economic structures to suit its ambitions. Civilians were caught in a delicate balance between adaptation, compliance, and defiance, navigating a landscape defined by fear, scarcity, and moral complexity. The early months of occupation had demonstrated both the efficiency of the German war machine and the indomitable spirit of those subjected to it. While the guns of Blitzkrieg had fallen silent, the struggle for autonomy, dignity, and survival had only begun. The stage was set for the long, arduous years of resistance, collaboration, and negotiation that would define the human experience in occupied Europe. In retrospect, the first months of occupation revealed a dual reality: the overwhelming might of the occupiers and the extraordinary resilience of the occupied. Cities, villages, and countryside alike bore witness to both the terror of repression and the quiet courage of ordinary people. As 1940 gave way to 1941, the foundations of organized resistance were taking shape, clandestine networks were expanding, and the vision of liberation remained alive in the hearts of those who refused to surrender their humanity. The shadow of control was long and oppressive, but even in the darkest corners of occupied Europe, hope endured, an ember that would one day ignite into a flame of rebellion, defiance, and ultimately, freedom. Life in the shadow. By the winter of 1941, the initial shock of conquest had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of sustained occupation. Across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, ordinary life continued under the oppressive gaze of German authorities, but it was a life transformed in ways that few could have anticipated. Streets that once hummed with trade and social interaction were now patrolled by soldiers whose presence was both intimidating and omnipresent. Daily routines became exercises in caution, as every interaction, every word spoken in public, and even private conversations carried the risk of attracting suspicion. For families, children, and the elderly, survival required constant vigilance, ingenuity, and adaptation. Food shortages dominated life in occupied Europe. German requisitions for military use left local markets sparse, forcing citizens to rely on rationing, black market exchanges, and small personal gardens to sustain themselves. In urban areas, families learned to stretch meager portions, improvising meals from whatever was available. Rural communities, while sometimes slightly better off, were not immune. Agricultural production was redirected to supply German troops, leaving locals with insufficient resources for their own families. Lines at bakeries and butcher shops became daily rituals, punctuated by tension, frustration, and occasional conflict. The scarcity of essential goods not only threatened physical survival but also heightened psychological strain, creating an atmosphere of anxiety and unease that permeated every aspect of life. Education, culture, and public institutions underwent a profound transformation under occupation. Schools were reorganized to reflect the priorities of the occupiers, emphasizing German language instruction, history, and ideology. Students were taught to revere the Reich and its leaders, while curricula on French, Belgian, or Dutch history were minimized or distorted. Libraries, theaters, and museums faced censorship, with books removed or banned and performances closely monitored. Yet, even under these constraints, clandestine efforts persisted. Teachers and intellectuals continued to pass on prohibited knowledge in secret, preserving cultural identity and offering subtle forms of resistance. Music, literature, and art became tools of defiance, symbols of resilience in a world increasingly dominated by fear. The social fabric of daily life was tested as communities grappled with the moral and practical challenges of occupation. Collaboration and compliance were often necessities, yet they carried social and ethical consequences. Some civilians cooperated with German authorities to secure food, maintain employment, or protect their families, while others resisted in secret. Informers and collaborators heightened suspicion, creating a climate where trust was fragile and loyalty constantly questioned. Families hid relatives, provided shelter to those fleeing persecution, and forged documents to help Jews, political dissidents, and other targeted groups evade arrest. These acts, though small, carried immense risk, with the threat of imprisonment, torture, or execution ever present. Resistance movements gained momentum during this period, evolving from sporadic acts of defiance into organized networks capable of coordinated operations. In France, groups such as the Free French and the Maquis began recruiting volunteers, sabotaging railways, and gathering intelligence for the Allies. Belgium witnessed similar activity, with underground newspapers, clandestine radio broadcasts, and targeted attacks on German infrastructure. In the Netherlands, networks of citizens worked tirelessly to distribute information, hide refugees, and undermine occupation policies. Despite the dangers, these movements flourished, fueled by a combination of patriotism, moral conviction, and the sheer determination to reclaim autonomy. Economic exploitation by the occupiers continued to shape the contours of civilian life. Factories and workshops were commandeered for the production of arms, vehicles, and other materials essential to the German war effort. Skilled workers were often forced into labor, either locally or transported to Germany, separating families and placing immense physical and emotional strain on communities. Farmers were compelled to meet quotas, surrendering crops, livestock, and other resources. Money grew scarce, inflation increased, and the value of savings diminished, leaving ordinary people to navigate a precarious financial reality. Yet even within these constraints, subtle forms of resistance persisted, slowing production, mislabeling goods, and covertly aiding those in need became ways to undermine the occupiers while maintaining a semblance of daily life. Life under occupation also imposed new social dynamics and roles. Women assumed responsibilities previously reserved for men, managing households, working in factories, and even participating in clandestine resistance activities. Children adapted to wartime routines, attending heavily controlled schools, helping with household survival, or assisting in underground operations. Communities formed networks of mutual support, sharing scarce resources, information, and protection. Religious institutions, while monitored and sometimes suppressed, became centers of solace and, occasionally, discreet resistance, offering spiritual sustenance and moral guidance to those enduring hardship. These adaptations reflected the extraordinary resilience of people living under constant pressure and uncertainty. The psychological toll of prolonged occupation was profound. Fear, anxiety, and grief were constant companions as families dealt with the disappearance of loved ones, arrests, and the ongoing threat of violence. The knowledge that neighbors, co-workers, or even acquaintances could betray them created an atmosphere of mistrust. Yet, even in this environment, acts of courage and solidarity persisted. Ordinary citizens risked their lives to smuggle messages, hide refugees, or defy oppressive regulations. In doing so, they maintained a fragile but crucial sense of agency and dignity, asserting the human spirit against forces designed to suppress it. Despite the weight of oppression, moments of normalcy persisted, however fleeting. Neighborhoods celebrated small holidays in private, children played in hidden courtyards, and families gathered for modest meals, preserving traditions where possible. Music and storytelling became acts of resistance as much as entertainment, offering solace and a sense of continuity in a disrupted world. The human need for connection, expression, and hope endured, demonstrating that even under the shadow of occupation, life could not be entirely extinguished. By late 1941, the framework of occupation had been solidified across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. German authorities had imposed strict control over political, economic, and social life, while civilian populations navigated the complexities of compliance, survival, and defiance. Resistance networks were expanding, clandestine communication channels were thriving, and the foundations of organized opposition were taking shape. Ordinary people had adapted to life under foreign domination, balancing daily survival with the moral imperative to resist. The early years of occupation, characterized by fear, deprivation, and adaptation, had set the stage for a protracted struggle that would define the experience of occupied Europe for years to come. In retrospect, the winter of 1941 revealed both the brutality of the occupiers and the resilience of the occupied. Civilians endured, adapted, and found ways to resist in subtle yet meaningful ways, demonstrating that oppression, no matter how thorough, could never entirely crush human ingenuity and courage. The story of daily life under occupation is one not merely of suffering, but of extraordinary endurance, resourcefulness, and hope, a testament to the ability of ordinary people to survive, resist, and preserve their humanity in the most extraordinary circumstances. Life in the shadow of control was difficult, dangerous, and often tragic, but it also revealed the depths of human courage and the enduring desire for freedom that would ultimately define the coming years of liberation and struggle. The long road to liberation. By 1944, the tides of war had begun to shift. Years of occupation had left deep scars on France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, physical, social, and psychological, but beneath the surface, the embers of resistance had never fully extinguished. Across towns, cities, and countryside, networks of courageous men and women continued to undermine German authority, preparing quietly for the moment when the Allies would arrive. The occupation had been a test of endurance, creativity, and moral resilience, and its final chapter would be written not only on battlefields but in the hearts and minds of ordinary citizens who had endured years of hardship, fear, and uncertainty. The liberation began with the monumental Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. D-Day, as it came to be known, marked the beginning of the end for German control in Western Europe. Thousands of soldiers stormed beaches under relentless fire, while resistance movements across occupied territories coordinated sabotage operations, disrupted German supply lines, and gathered crucial intelligence. In France, the Free French forces, supported by local resistance fighters, played a decisive role in reclaiming towns and cities from German occupation. The coordination between external military operations and internal resistance exemplified the determination of the occupied populations to regain sovereignty and dignity after 4 long years under oppressive control. Belgium experienced liberation in a series of carefully executed advances by Allied forces. Cities like Brussels and Antwerp were reclaimed amid both jubilation and devastation. The German retreat was chaotic, leaving behind scorched towns, abandoned infrastructure, and evidence of atrocities committed against civilians and prisoners of war. Belgian resistance fighters had prepared meticulously for this moment, guiding Allied troops, providing intelligence, and ensuring that strategic targets were prioritized during liberation efforts. Civilians, long constrained by rationing, curfews, and fear, now confronted the simultaneous relief and trauma of liberation. Families reunited, yet communities were forced to reckon with the losses, destruction, and moral compromises endured during occupation. The Netherlands faced a particularly harsh liberation process. While southern regions were liberated relatively quickly following Allied advances in late 1944, the northern provinces experienced prolonged suffering during the so-called Hunger Winter of 1944 to 1945. Starvation, disease, and infrastructural collapse caused immense civilian suffering even as liberation forces approached. The Dutch resistance, which had operated in secrecy for years, played an essential role in maintaining hope, organizing relief efforts, and facilitating the arrival of Allied troops. Cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, though eventually freed, bore the visible scars of war, bombed-out buildings, displaced populations, and communities forever altered by the experience of occupation. Liberation brought both relief and profound challenges. Decades of suppression, resource depletion, and forced collaboration left societies grappling with complex moral, social, and political questions. Individuals who had collaborated, whether willingly or under duress, faced public scrutiny, legal proceedings, and sometimes violent retribution. At the same time, communities sought to recognize and honor those who had resisted, risking their lives to protect neighbors, disrupt German operations, or aid the Allies. The process of reckoning with occupation was not simple. It required balancing justice, reconciliation, and the practical need to rebuild functioning societies from the rubble of war. The physical and economic toll of occupation was immense. Factories, bridges, railways, and housing had been damaged or destroyed, and food shortages persisted in many regions even after the arrival of Allied forces. Reconstruction efforts were monumental undertakings. Governments, both restored and newly empowered, faced the task of revitalizing economies, repairing infrastructure, and providing for displaced populations. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands alike, the post-liberation period demanded enormous resilience, cooperation, and innovation from citizens who had endured years of scarcity and hardship. The psychological recovery was equally significant. Communities had to rebuild trust, restore cultural life, and process the trauma inflicted by occupation. The long-term impact of German occupation extended far beyond immediate material and social consequences. It reshaped political institutions, accelerated social change, and altered the trajectory of national identity. In France, the Vichy regime's collaboration with the Nazis led to enduring debates about accountability, resistance, and the moral responsibilities of citizens under occupation. Belgium confronted the legacy of collaboration and resistance, re-evaluating its national narrative and the contributions of its diverse population. The Netherlands faced the dual challenge of reconstructing its devastated infrastructure while honoring the sacrifices of those who had fought and suffered during the occupation. Across all three countries, memories of occupation would shape generations, influencing politics, education, and cultural identity for decades to come. Resistance movements, forged in the crucible of oppression, emerged as symbols of national pride and resilience. Individuals who had risked their lives to oppose the occupiers were celebrated as heroes, their stories immortalized in literature, commemorations, and public memory. At the same time, communities grappled with the darker aspects of occupation, betrayal, forced compliance, and the complex moral choices that civilians had faced under extreme duress. These reflections became central to national conversations about ethics, justice, and the human capacity for courage and complicity alike. Occupation, once a period of fear and deprivation, became a lens through which societies examined the limits of authority, the importance of solidarity, and the enduring value of human dignity. By 1945, with the surrender of Germany, the formal period of occupation had ended, yet its consequences lingered. Cities bore the scars of war, families mourned the dead, and nations faced the monumental task of rebuilding not only infrastructure but also trust and social cohesion. Schools, hospitals, and public institutions were gradually restored, yet the memories of persecution, forced labor, deportation, and deprivation remained vivid. Citizens who had endured years of control and oppression now faced the dual challenges of reconstruction and remembrance, ensuring that the lessons of occupation would inform future policies, prevent repetition, and honor the sacrifices of those who had suffered and resisted. The liberation of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands also had profound implications for Europe as a whole. It demonstrated the resilience of occupied populations, the effectiveness of coordinated resistance, and the necessity of international cooperation in confronting tyranny. It highlighted the interconnectedness of military, political, and civilian actions in shaping the outcomes of war. Moreover, it underscored the enduring importance of human agency. Even in the darkest times, individuals and communities can exert influence, preserve dignity, and sow the seeds of eventual freedom. In retrospect, the German occupation of these Western European nations was more than a military conquest. It was a period that tested the limits of human endurance, morality, and ingenuity. The years under occupation exposed the vulnerabilities of societies, the resilience of individuals, and the complex interplay between oppression and resistance. Liberation marked the end of one chapter, but its lessons endured. Citizens who had navigated fear, scarcity, and moral ambiguity carried forward experiences that would shape post-war reconstruction, social values, and national identity. The occupation and subsequent liberation of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands stand as enduring reminders of both the horrors of war and the capacity for courage, resistance, and hope in the face of overwhelming adversity.